May 19th, 1920. A train pulls into Matewan, West Virginia, carrying 13 men with badges and guns. They're not there to keep the peace. They're there to evict families from their homes. By sunset, 10 of them would be dead in the street. This wasn't just another labor dispute. This was the day coal miners decided they'd had enough of living like prisoners in their own country. And what happened next would expose a system so brutal, so completely rigged against working people, that it would take a private army and the United States military to keep it running. The bodies were still warm when the coal companies started rewriting the story. They called it a riot, an ambush. They said the miners were dangerous radicals who needed to be put down. But here's what they didn't want you to know. Those miners had tried everything legal first. They'd tried organizing. They'd tried negotiations. They'd tried going through the proper channels. The coal companies responded by evicting their families into the mountains in the middle of winter. So if you want to understand what really happened at Matewan, if you want to know why the coal companies were so terrified of what those miners discovered, you need to understand what life was actually like in the coal fields of West Virginia in 1920. Because what they found wasn't just injustice. It was a system designed to keep them enslaved in everything but name. If you're here because you want to know the real story, hit subscribe. This is the kind of history they don't teach in schools because the people who won wrote the textbooks. Let's go back to the beginning. The coal fields of southern West Virginia in 1920 weren't part of America. Not really. They were company towns, and the coal companies owned everything. The houses, the stores, the schools, the churches, the police. They even issued their own currency called scrip that was only good at company stores where prices were marked up 300%. If you were born in a coal camp, you were born into debt. Your father owed the company for the house, for the equipment he used underground, for the doctor who delivered you, for the casket they'd bury him in when the mine killed him. And it would kill him. 1 in 7 coal miners died on the job. The companies didn't even bother reporting most of the deaths. The companies called this system industrial paternalism. They said they were taking care of their workers like a father takes care of his children. But here's what that really meant. If you complained about safety conditions, you were fired. If you tried to organize a union, you were blacklisted and could never work in coal again. If you talked to a union organizer, company detectives would beat you in your own home while your family watched. And if you still didn't get the message, they'd evict your entire family and hire someone else. The company store system was designed to keep miners in permanent debt. Everything cost more at the company store. A loaf of bread that cost 10 cents in town cost 30 cents at the company store. But miners couldn't shop in town because they were paid in scrip, not real money. Scrip was worthless anywhere except the company store. It was a closed loop designed to extract every penny back from the workers. Miners would finish a month of dangerous work underground and end up owing the company money. The rent, the tools, the carbide for their lamps, the doctor visits for their sick children, the medicine from the company pharmacy. It all added up faster than their wages. Some miners died still owing the company money. Their widows inherited the debt. The houses the companies provided weren't homes, they were shacks. 4 rooms if you were lucky, no insulation, gaps in the walls where winter wind cut through. 1 coal stove that never kept the place warm enough. An outhouse in the back that froze solid in January. Families of 8 or 10 people crammed into spaces meant for 4. The coal dust got into everything. Your lungs, your clothes, your food, your bed. Miners would cough up black phlegm every morning. Their wives would wash their work clothes and the water would turn black. Children grew up breathing that dust. By the time they were old enough to work in the mines themselves, their lungs were already damaged. And the companies knew. They knew the mines were death traps. They knew the ventilation systems were inadequate. They knew the safety equipment was outdated. They knew explosions were inevitable when you forced men to work in poorly ventilated shafts filled with methane and coal dust. They knew, and they didn't care because dead miners were cheaper than safety upgrades. The Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency made sure everyone got the message. These weren't detectives in the sense of investigating crimes. They were private mercenaries hired by the coal companies to terrorize workers into submission. They carried rifles, machine guns, and eviction notices. They had more authority in the coal camps than the actual police because they were the police. Albert Phelps ran the agency with his brothers. They cut their teeth breaking strikes in Pennsylvania and West Virginia. They had a simple philosophy: violence works. Make an example of one family and 10 others fall in line. Burn down a union organizer's house, and 100 miners think twice about joining. The Baldwin Felts men lived in the coal camps. They watched everything. They knew which miners attended union meetings. They knew who talked to organizers. They knew who complained about conditions. They kept lists. And when the companies wanted someone gone, Baldwin Felts handled it. They'd show up at your house at 2 a.m, kick in the door, drag you out in front of your wife and children, beat you in the street as a warning to your neighbors. If you fought back, they'd shoot you and claim self-defense. No one would investigate. No one would file charges. The coal companies owned the law. Some Baldwin Felts agents were former police. Some were former soldiers. Some were just thugs who enjoyed the work. They got paid well, better than the miners they terrorized. They had nice clothes, good food, warm houses, all funded by coal company money, all in exchange for keeping the workers in line. The agents carried badges that said "Mine Guard." But they weren't guarding the mines. They were guarding the system. They were making sure miners stayed afraid, stayed obedient, stayed trapped. They were the enforcers of industrial slavery. The state government looked the other way because the coal companies owned the state government. West Virginia coal generated millions in tax revenue. Senators and governors got elected with coal company money. Judges ruled in favor of coal companies because coal company lawyers became judges. It was a closed system, a perfect machine for extracting wealth from the ground and labor from human beings. By 1920, the miners in southern West Virginia had watched this system crush their fathers and their brothers. They'd attended funerals for men killed by explosions that happened because companies refused to spend money on ventilation. They'd seen children with rickets and black lung because company doctors said they were fine. They'd worked 12-hour shifts in darkness 700 feet underground for wages that left them deeper in debt at the end of every month. And then the United Mine Workers of America came to town. The UMWA had been organizing coal miners since 1890. They'd won major contracts in northern coal states, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois. They'd established the 8-hour day, safety regulations, fair wages, the right to be paid in actual money instead of scrip. They'd proven that organized workers could stand up to the coal companies and win. But southern West Virginia was different. The companies here were more violent, more entrenched, more willing to use force to keep unions out. They'd successfully blocked every organizing attempt for 30 years. They had the government, the courts, and an army of private detectives on their side. The UMWA knew it would be a fight. They sent their best organizers into the coalfields in 1919. Men like Frank Keeney and Fred Mooney, who'd grown up in coal camps and knew what miners were facing. They held secret meetings in the mountains. They signed up members in whispered conversations after shifts. They built the union one miner at a time. The organizers had to be careful. If the Baldwin Felts agents caught them, they'd be beaten or killed. So they met in churches, in homes, in remote mountain locations where company spies couldn't follow. They passed information through trusted networks. They used code words. They treated every new recruit as a potential informant until they proved themselves. The union's message was simple. Together you have power. Alone you have nothing. The coal companies want you divided and afraid. But if every miner in West Virginia joins the union, the companies can't fire all of you. They can't replace all of you. They need you more than you need them. It was a dangerous message. Miners who joined the union knew they were risking everything, their jobs, their homes, their safety, their families. But thousands joined anyway because they'd reached the point where they had nothing left to lose. When you're already trapped in debt, already living in a shack, already breathing poison every day, what more can they take from you? The union provided something the companies never did: hope. The organizers told stories about northern coalfields where union miners had won contracts, where they worked 8-hour shifts instead of 12, where they got paid real money instead of scrip, where their children went to real schools instead of company schools that taught them to be obedient workers, where men died in mines far less often because union contracts required safety equipment. The miners in West Virginia wanted that life. They wanted to be treated like human beings instead of equipment. They wanted their children to have futures that didn't involve dying underground at 40. They wanted the basic dignity of a fair wage and a safe workplace. The union promised them that was possible. By spring of 1920, thousands of miners in southern West Virginia had joined the UMWR. They thought they were protected by federal law. The Clayton Act of 1914 supposedly guaranteed workers the right to organize. They thought if they did everything legally, if they followed the proper procedures, the companies would have to recognize them. They were wrong. The coal companies responded with a coordinated attack. They fired every miner they suspected of union membership. They evicted families from company housing with 24 hours' notice. They brought in the Baldwin-Felts detectives to enforce the evictions at gunpoint. And they got friendly judges to issue injunctions making it illegal for miners to even talk about unions. The evictions were brutal. Baldwin-Felts agents would show up at a house with rifles and a court order. They'd drag furniture into the street. They'd throw women and children out into the mud. If anyone resisted, they'd beat them. The evicted families had nowhere to go. The coal companies owned all the land. Setting up a tent on the roadside was trespassing. The UMWA responded by setting up tent colonies. They rented land outside company control and built temporary housing for evicted families. By May 1920, hundreds of mining families were living in canvas tents on the outskirts of Matewan. They had no running water, no heat, no protection from the weather. But they had each other. And they had hope that the union would win them their jobs back. Life in the tent colonies was brutal. Winter in the West Virginia mountains is unforgiving. Temperatures dropped below zero. Snow piled up feet deep. The canvas tents provided almost no insulation. Families burned whatever wood they could scavenge to stay warm. Some mornings parents would wake up to find ice frozen on the inside of the tent. Children got sick. Pneumonia, influenza, frostbite. The union brought in doctors when they could, but medical care was limited. Some children died. Their parents buried them in the frozen ground and kept fighting because what else could they do? Going back to the company meant surrender, meant accepting slavery. The tent colonies became communities. Women organized food distribution. Men set up guard rotations to watch for company attacks. Families shared what little they had. If one tent got extra food, it was distributed to those who had less. If someone had medicine, it went to whoever needed it most. They were building something the coal companies had never allowed: solidarity. The union kept the tent colonies supplied through donations from other UMWA locals across the country. Northern miners who'd won their own fight sent money, food, blankets, medicine. The solidarity extended beyond West Virginia. This wasn't just a local fight. This was about whether American workers had any rights at all. But supplies were never enough. There were too many evicted families, too many mouths to feed, too much need. The union was spending money faster than donations came in. Everyone knew the tent colonies couldn't last forever. Either the union would win recognition and the miners would get their jobs back, or the coal companies would find a way to crush the resistance. The coal companies saw the tent colonies as a direct threat. As long as evicted miners had somewhere to go, as long as the union could keep them fed and housed, the evictions weren't working. The miners weren't being terrorized back into submission. They were getting more organized, so the companies decided to escalate. On May 19, 1920, 13 Baldwin-Felts detectives arrived in Matewan on the morning train. They were led by Albert and Lee Felts, the brothers who ran the agency. They carried a new batch of eviction notices and enough weapons to enforce them. Their plan was simple: evict more families, make more examples, show the miners that the union couldn't protect them. But Matewan was different from other coal towns. The mayor was a man named Cabell Testaman, who actually sympathized with the miners. And the chief of police was Sid Hatfield. Sid Hatfield was not someone you wanted as an enemy. He was related to the Hatfield family from the famous Hatfield and McCoy feud. He'd grown up in the mountains. He knew how to handle a gun, and he didn't intimidate easily. He'd been a miner himself before becoming a lawman. He understood what the companies were doing to his people. Hatfield stood 6 feet tall and carried himself like he owned every room he walked into. He wore a suit and tie even in the coalfields where most men wore work clothes. He kept his guns clean and his aim sharp. The Baldwin Felts agents had heard about him. They knew he wasn't like other small-town police chiefs who backed down when company detectives showed up. The miners loved him. He was one of them who'd made it into a position of authority. He hadn't forgotten where he came from. He hadn't been bought by coal company money. When Baldwin Felts agents harassed miners on the streets of Matewan, Hatfield ran them off. When company spies tried to infiltrate union meetings, Hatfield warned the organisers. He was using his badge to protect workers instead of corporations. The coal companies wanted him gone. They'd tried to get him fired. They'd pressured the mayor to replace him. They'd offered him money to look the other way. Hatfield refused. He told them Matewan was his town, and as long as he was police chief, company thugs weren't welcome. That made May, on the 19th, 1920, inevitable. The Baldwin Felts agents knew they'd have to go through Hatfield to enforce the evictions. They thought their numbers and their reputation would be enough. They thought one small-town cop wouldn't stand in their way. They were wrong. When the Baldwin Felts detectives started making evictions that morning, Hatfield confronted them. He told them they had no authority in Matewan. The detectives laughed at him. They worked for the coal companies. They had more authority than any local police chief. Hatfield went to Mayor Testaman. Together they reviewed the eviction notices and discovered they were questionable. The legal grounds were thin. Testaman backed Hatfield. He told the detectives to stop the evictions until the papers could be properly reviewed. Albert Felts was furious. Nobody told Baldwin Felts detectives what to do. Not mayors, not police chiefs, not miners. He told Hatfield that he was the one who was done. He had a warrant for Hatfield's arrest. Hatfield was under arrest for threatening an officer. That's when things went sideways. Accounts differ on exactly what happened next. Some say Hatfield went for his gun first. Others say one of the detectives fired into the crowd. What's clear is that within seconds gunfire erupted on the streets of Matewan. The miners who'd been watching from doorways and alleys pulled out weapons. The detectives scattered and returned fire. Mayor Testaman ran out of his hardware store trying to stop the shooting and was hit in the stomach. He died within minutes. 2 miners died in the initial exchange. 7 Baldwin Felts detectives went down in the first 30 seconds. The shooting lasted less than 3 minutes. When it was over, 10 people were dead. 7 of them were Baldwin Felts detectives, including both Albert and Lee Felts. 2 miners were killed. Mayor Testaman was dead on the street in front of his own store. Sid Hatfield was still standing, gun in hand, surrounded by armed miners. The street was covered in blood and shell casings. Bodies lay where they had fallen. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air. Townspeople emerged from buildings where they'd taken cover. Women screamed for their husbands. Children cried. The hardware store where Testaman had tried to stop the violence had bullet holes in the walls. The surviving Baldwin Felts agents ran. Some made it to the train station. Others fled into the mountains. The miners let them go. This hadn't been about killing every company agent. It had been about standing up to them, about showing them that terrorizing families had consequences. Word spread fast. Within hours, every coal camp in southern West Virginia knew what had happened in Matewan. Miners gathered in secret to discuss it. Baldwin Felts detectives dead in the street. Sid Hatfield still free. The coal companies hadn't been able to stop it. Some miners celebrated. Finally, someone had fought back and won. Others were terrified. They knew the companies would retaliate. They knew this meant war, but everyone understood that something fundamental had changed. The system of fear had been broken. Workers had proven they could stand against company violence and survive. The coal companies went ballistic. This was their worst nightmare. Workers had killed company agents. The system of fear and control had been challenged with bullets. If miners in Matewan could stand up to the Baldwin Felts agency and win, miners everywhere might get the same idea. The newspapers the next day called it the Matewan Massacre. They painted the miners as murderous radicals who'd ambushed innocent lawmen. They said Sid Hatfield was a killer who needed to be brought to justice. They demanded the state government send in troops to restore order. But the miners saw it differently. They called it the Matewan shootout. They said it was self-defense. They said the Baldwin Felts detectives had been terrorizing families for years, and finally someone stood up to them. They made Sid Hatfield a folk hero, the man who stood up to the company thugs and lived to tell about it. The coal companies wanted Hatfield dead or in prison. They pressured the state government to bring murder charges. Hatfield was arrested and put on trial for the murder of Albert Felts. The trial became a national sensation. Reporters from New York and Chicago descended on West Virginia to cover it. For the first time, the national media was paying attention to what was happening in the coalfields. The trial revealed things the coal companies didn't want public. Witnesses testified about the evictions, about families thrown into the street, about Baldwin Felts detectives beating miners in their homes. They testified about company stores and scrip and wages that left workers in perpetual debt. They testified about men dying in unsafe mines while companies paid dividends to shareholders. Defense lawyers painted a picture of systematic oppression. They showed the jury documentation of evictions. They presented evidence of Baldwin Felts' violence going back years. They brought in miners who'd been beaten, widows whose husbands had been killed in company-sanctioned violence, children who'd watched detectives destroy their homes. The prosecution tried to focus on the shootout itself. They argued that Hatfield and the miners had ambushed the detectives, that this was premeditated murder. But their case fell apart when witnesses testified that the Baldwin Felts agents had drawn their weapons first. That Mayor Testaman, a respected businessman, had been trying to stop the violence when he was killed. That Hatfield had been defending his town. The jury saw through the coal company narrative. They understood what was really on trial. Not whether Sid Hatfield had killed Albert Felts, but whether American workers had the right to defend themselves against corporate violence, whether the rule of law applied to everyone or just to those with money and power. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Not guilty on all counts. The miners celebrated. Hatfield walked out of the courthouse a free man and a bigger hero than before. The coal companies had tried to make an example of him and failed. The legal system had actually worked for once, but the companies weren't done. In the year after Matewan, the violence escalated across southern West Virginia. The coal companies brought in more Baldwin Felts detectives. They brought in strikebreakers from other states. They got more injunctions from friendly judges. They evicted more families and broke up more union meetings. The miners fought back. They sabotaged equipment. They blocked roads. They ran gun battles with company detectives in the hills. Southern West Virginia became a war zone. The coal companies called it anarchy. The miners called it resistance. The UMWA kept organizing. Membership grew. The tent colonies expanded. The Union brought in food and supplies. They held out through the winter of 1920 and into 1921. They believed if they could hold on long enough, if they could stay organized and united, they'd win recognition. Then the coal companies made their move on the tent colonies. It started with smaller attacks. Company detectives would raid a tent colony at night, rough up a few miners, destroy some supplies. The Union Guards would drive them off. Then the attacks got more organized. Larger groups of armed men would assault a colony, burn a few tents, shoot at anyone who resisted. By summer of 1921, the coal companies were using military tactics. They'd bring in 50 or 100 armed men, surround a tent colony and level it. They'd burn everything: tents, supplies, food, personal belongings. Families would wake up to gunfire and have minutes to grab their children and run into the woods. The most notorious attack came in late August 1921. Company forces surrounded the tent colony at Blair Mountain with machine guns and rifles. They had several hundred men. They had support from local law enforcement. They had orders to clear out the Union families by any means necessary. The miners at Blair Mountain had been expecting this. They'd organized their own defense. They had rifles and shotguns. They had men who'd served in World War I and knew how to fight. They'd built defensive positions in the hills. When the company forces attacked, the miners fought back. The Battle of Blair Mountain lasted 5 days. It wasn't a riot or a skirmish. It was an actual battle with organized formations, artillery, even aerial reconnaissance. The coal companies hired private planes to drop bombs on miner positions. Over 1 million rounds were fired. The fighting could be heard 50 miles away. The miners had organized themselves into military units. Men who'd served in France during World War I took command positions. They established defensive lines along the ridges. They set up supply lines. They coordinated movements. This wasn't a mob. This was an army of workers fighting for their rights. The coal companies brought in everything they had. Hundreds of deputized company men armed with rifles and machine guns, private detectives from multiple agencies, local law enforcement loyal to the companies. They had better weapons, more ammunition, and unlimited funding from coal company, bank accounts. The battle shifted back and forth across the mountain. Miners would take a ridge, company forces would push them back. Company forces would advance, miners would ambush them from the trees. Both sides dug trenches. Both sides took casualties. The mountain ran red with blood. Civilians trapped in nearby towns hid in basements as bullets flew overhead. Families evacuated to safer areas. Local hospitals overflowed with wounded. This was war in the American heartland, and most of the country had no idea it was happening. The miners held their ground for days. They inflicted heavy casualties on company forces. They proved they could fight trained mercenaries and win. For a moment, it looked like they might actually win. Estimates vary, but between 50 and 100 people died at Blair Mountain. The miners held their ground for days. They inflicted heavy casualties on company forces. For a moment, it looked like they might actually win. Then President Warren Harding sent in the United States Army. Federal troops arrived with tanks, machine guns, and orders to end the uprising. The miners were facing the U.S. military. Some wanted to keep fighting. Union leaders convinced them to stand down. You couldn't win against the army. Fighting federal troops would turn them from workers defending their rights into traitors. The army came in force. Infantry battalions, artillery units, machine gun companies. They surrounded Blair Mountain and gave the miners an ultimatum. Surrender or be destroyed. The government had chosen sides. They weren't there to mediate. They weren't there to investigate coal company crimes. They were there to break the strike and restore order. The miners faced an impossible choice. They'd proven they could fight company mercenaries, but fighting federal soldiers was different. That was treason. That was insurrection. Many of these men had served in the army during World War I. They'd fought for America in France. Now America was pointing guns at them for demanding basic human rights. Some miners wanted to fight anyway. They'd come this far. They'd lost friends and family. They'd sacrificed everything. Surrendering meant it was all for nothing. But the Union leaders knew the truth. If they fought the army, they'd be massacred, and public opinion would turn against them completely. Workers fighting company thugs was one thing. Workers fighting American soldiers was another. The miners surrendered. Hundreds were arrested. Many were charged with treason and murder. The tent colonies were destroyed. The Union was broken. The coal companies had won. In the aftermath, the coal companies did everything they could to erase what had happened. They controlled the newspapers in West Virginia. They made sure the story was told their way. The miners were violent radicals. The Union was full of communists and troublemakers. The companies were the victims defending their property rights. Sid Hatfield never made it to Blair Mountain. He was murdered on August 1st, 1921. He was climbing the courthouse steps in Welch, West Virginia to face bogus charges when Baldwin Felts detectives shot him in the back. They shot him 13 times. They killed his friend Ed Chambers too. The detectives claimed self-defense. They were never convicted. The assassination was broad daylight murder in front of witnesses. Hatfield and Chambers were unarmed. They were going to court, accompanied by their wives. The Baldwin Felts agents waited on the courthouse steps. As Hatfield climbed toward them, they opened fire. No warning, no chance to surrender, just execution. Hatfield's wife, Jessie, watched her husband die. She screamed and ran to him. The detectives kept shooting. They wanted to make sure he was dead. 13 bullets. They emptied their guns into him. This wasn't about self-defense. This was revenge for the Matewan shootout. This was sending a message to anyone who stood up to the coal companies. Ed Chambers died instantly. Hatfield lived long enough to know he'd been killed, long enough to see his wife's face. Then he was gone. The man who'd stood up to the Baldwin Felts agency. The man who'd been acquitted of murder, the folk hero of the coal miners, dead on courthouse steps while his killers stood over him. The detectives were arrested. They went to trial. They testified that Hatfield had gone for a gun, that they'd acted in self-defense. Witnesses said that was a lie, said Hatfield was unarmed, said the detectives had murdered him in cold blood. The jury acquitted the detectives anyway. Coal company money bought a lot of things in West Virginia, including justice. The trials after Blair Mountain destroyed what was left of the Union movement in southern West Virginia. Hundreds of miners were prosecuted. Legal fees bankrupted the UMWA's regional offices. Many miners were blacklisted and could never work in coal again. Others left the state entirely. The coal companies went back to business as usual. They kept paying wages in scrip. They kept running unsafe mines. They kept the company store system that trapped workers in debt. They kept hiring private detectives to intimidate anyone who talked about organizing. It would take another 15 years and the National Labor Relations Act of 1935 before the UMWA could successfully organize southern West Virginia coal miners. By then, most of the men who fought at Matewan and Blair Mountain were dead or too old to work. For decades, the Battle of Blair Mountain was largely forgotten outside West Virginia. It wasn't taught in schools. It wasn't in history textbooks. The coal companies and their allies had successfully buried the story. When Americans thought about labor history, they thought about factory strikes in northern cities. They didn't think about armed miners fighting a private army in the mountains of West Virginia. But the story survived in the coal fields. Miners told their sons and grandsons what really happened. They passed down the names: Sid Hatfield, Frank Keeney, Fred Mooney. They remembered Blair Mountain not as a failure, but as proof that working people would fight for dignity and justice, even when the odds were impossible. The coal companies worked hard to erase the memory. They pressured schools to exclude it from curricula. They influenced historians to downplay its significance. They framed it as an embarrassing episode of labor violence rather than what it really was, a workers' uprising against corporate tyranny. For generations, most Americans didn't know it had happened. The physical evidence was buried too. The battlefield at Blair Mountain was nearly destroyed in the 2000s when coal companies wanted to strip mine the mountain. Activists fought to preserve it as a historical site. They argued that this was where American workers had stood up to corporate power and government oppression, that it deserved to be remembered the same way we remember Revolutionary War battlefields. The fight to preserve Blair Mountain revealed something important. The coal companies were still trying to erase the story, still trying to destroy the evidence, still trying to make sure nobody remembered that workers had once organized an army and fought back. Because if people remembered that workers had done it once, they might realize workers could do it again. What they found at Matewan in 1920 wasn't gold or coal or buried treasure. What they found was a breaking point. A moment when people who'd been pushed to the edge decided they'd rather die fighting than live on their knees. The coal companies tried to bury that story along with the bodies. They tried to make sure nobody would remember that American workers once took up arms against American companies, and the companies had to call in the military to win. The tent colonies are gone now. The coal camps are abandoned. The mines have mostly closed. The companies extracted everything valuable and moved on. But the memory of what happened survives because the basic question never got answered. In a country that talks constantly about freedom, what do you do when the people who own everything use that power to take away your freedom? The miners at Matewan tried everything legal. They organized within the law, they followed procedures, they worked through the system. The system responded with evictions and beatings and murder. So they stopped following the rules of a system that was rigged against them from the start. That's what the coal companies were really afraid of. Not the union itself, but what it represented. The idea that workers could organize and demand to be treated like human beings instead of equipment. The idea that economic power didn't give companies the right to control every aspect of workers' lives. The idea that you could say no. The massacre at Matewan was the moment workers said no and the companies realised fear wasn't working anymore. Blair Mountain was what happened when the companies decided to use overwhelming force to crush that resistance. The fact that it took the United States Army to break a strike should tell you everything about how much power those miners had when they stood together. They burned the tent colonies by Friday, they arrested hundreds, they broke the union, they restored order, but they couldn't kill the idea. 15 years later, coal miners in West Virginia would organize again. This time, they'd win. They'd win because the memory of Matewan and Blair Mountain taught them that solidarity works, that standing together works, that you can lose every battle and still win the war if you don't give up. The coal companies wanted Matewan to be a lesson in what happens when workers challenge power. It was, just not the lesson they intended. The lesson was that people will only accept injustice for so long, that eventually someone stands up, that when they do, others will stand with them even knowing it might cost them everything. That's what they found at Matewan. Not a massacre, but a moment when ordinary people decided their dignity was worth more than their fear. The coal companies tried to bury that truth under 100 years of propaganda and forgotten history. But you can't bury truth forever. Eventually, someone digs it up and shows people what really happened. This is what really happened. Remember it,